Hi, I'm Kristen Gula, and today I'm going to be teaching you 7 of my favorite beginner embroidery stitches. When I first started learning hand embroidery, there weren't a lot of good video resources on beginner embroidery stitches to learn. So I thought I would make a compilation of all of my favorite beginner stitches that are also found in my book, 200 Embroidered Flowers, which I will link in the description for you. So come on. Let's get started. The first stitch we're going to be learning is the back stitch. To start the back stitch, make sure you bring your needle up through the fabric from behind. Then go back into the fabric about the length of a grain of rice. Then continue your line here. Come back up, same length here. You're going to go back, hence the name back stitch, into the previous stitch. Then you will just keep on going, making sure that when you go around a curve, you make your stitches just a little bit shorter, so that way you don't have a jagged curve. Trying to keep it smooth. Then when you get back to the straight part, you can make your stitches all the same length again. And that is the back stitch. Now the next stitch I'm going to teach you is the whipped back stitch. And this stitch is a continuation of the back stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to want to stitch a back stitch line, which we just did. And then you're going to want to take your thread. Now I've picked a different color thread so you can see how I am weaving the thread through the back stitches, all right? So what you're going to do is bring your needle up through the end of the last stitch that you made. Then take the thread with your thumb and hold on to it right there. Take your needle and you're going to weave underneath the stitch. You're not going to weave into the fabric, just underneath the stitch, like so. Pull the thread through and pull it away from you. Grab the thread with your thumb again. Go to the next stitch. And just keep on going, making sure to always pull the thread away from you. I like to turn my hoop as I go. It makes it easier to do the whip stitch, keep them consistent. I really like this stitch doing text, outlining. It gives you a nice solid rope look to it. And then when you're done, you take your needle and you push right into the end of that stitch. And there you go, whipped back stitch. Now the next stitch we're gonna learn is the straight stitch. And this might be the easiest stitch you will ever learn. What you'll be doing is you're going to take the needle up through the fabric and then taking the needle right back down into the fabric. And that's it. This stitch is used to cover lines, detail and flower work. When you were a kid and you had a sun in the corner and you do the little sunburst, those would be used for straight stitches. Now there are no length requirements for a straight stitch. You can make it as long as you want. However, when you make it too long, it will have the tendency to come off of the fabric. So if you're wanting to do a longer line in your work, I would suggest using a whipped back stitch or some of the other stitches I'm about to teach you. Now the next stitch I'm going to teach you is called the satin stitch, and this stitch actually uses straight stitches and is used as a filler stitch. The stitch also gets its name because when it's finished, it should look like a piece of satin is laying on your fabric. So what you're going to do is you're going to bring your needle up right next to that straight stitch we just made, and then you're going to do another straight stitch right next to it. This stitch is pretty much just a bunch of straight stitches lying right next to each other. And there are different ways to do this stitch. If you want to add a back stitch outline first and then satin stitch over it, there's a lot of different variations for it. But this is just your standard satin stitch. The next stitch I'm going to teach you is the stem stitch. This stitch is used to make little stems for your flowers or even outlining if you don't want to use a whipped back stitch. Now there are 2 parts to this stitch, so pay attention and look closely. What we'll be doing is you'll be coming up through the fabric, making sure to grab the thread with your thumb. Then you're going to be going forward into the fabric. And as you can see, it makes a little loop. Now this step only works for the first stitch of the line of stitches that you're making. You're going to come up through the center of these 2 stitch points. Pull through, and as soon as the needle comes through the fabric, you let go of the thread, and that's the first stitch. Now the next part, you grab the thread with your thumb again, you go forward again, making sure that you make that loop, because you want to make sure the stitches are on the same side each time. Then you're going to come up through the fabric again, this time though not in the center, but at the end of the previous stitch. And that's it. You just keep on going. And when you're finished, make sure you take your needle and poke it into the end of your last stitch. And that is a stem stitch. Now the next stitch that I'm going to be teaching you is the French knot. Now this is a stitch that is primarily done on top of the fabric and makes a little cute little knot that can be used on adding detail, all different types of things onto your embroidery work. Before we get started, I'm going to use a hack that I like to use since I don't knot my knots before I stitch. Bring your needle up through the fabric, then turn around, grab your thread, and wrap it around the screw of your hoop. Normally you would knot the thread before stitching, but when you do that, you have a better chance of stitching your French knot into that knot and then having to start over. Then when you're done stitching your French knots, you can undo the thread here and tie a knot, so that way you get a nice clean finish. All right, let's get started doing our French knot. What you're gonna do is you're gonna hold the needle in your dominant hand, making sure the eye of the needle is pressing against the fabric with the point of the needle going up. Take your non-dominant hand and grab the thread coming out of the fabric. Now the tension is the most important thing here. You're gonna wanna make sure you pull that tight, because that's the part that's going to wrap around the needle. Take the needle, place it on the fabric, don't move it. Take the thread, wrap it around once, making sure to pull back behind the needle. Then wrap it around a second time, making sure to pull back. Then slowly rotate your needle down to go back into the fabric, not into the same hole, but right next to that first stitch point. Now, before you continue to push the needle through the fabric, you want to check your tension and make sure that your knots are tight enough. So go ahead, grab your thread, and make your needle dance a little bit. That's how you'll know that it's tight enough. Reach around, grab the back of the needle, pull it through, and once that needle pops through the fabric, you can let go of your thread, and you have a French knot. Now our last and final stitch is a stitch I created for my book called Variated Back Stitch. This stitch is a filler stitch, kind of like the long and short stitch, but without all the rules. What you'll be doing is, instead of following a certain pattern to fill in a space, you'll just be putting in back stitches to fill it in, like so. Bring the needle up through the fabric, and just start doing little back stitches to fill in whatever space you're needing to fill in. This helps, in my opinion, to keep this filler stitch looking more organic versus that brick uniform look that can sometimes happen with long and short stitch. You might want to use this stitch whenever you have a really large area to fill in. That satin stitch would just be too bubbly and too long to cover. If you're not sure about some of these stitches, don't hesitate to leave me some comments down below. And don't forget to check out my Patreon, where we have a community there where we're talking about all things embroidery all the time. Thank you so much for watching, and tune in next week. We'll have another video coming to you soon. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to learn.